So now on to the topic of the meeting. We have two speakers, and I'm going to introduce first Ira and then Susan after Ira speaks. But we're going to hold questions until after both of them have spoken. And Tony's going to be the moderator during the question and answer period. Right, Tony?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Dr. Ira Helfand is immediate past president of the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War and a member of the steering committee of International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. He'll speak on Ukraine and the growing danger of nuclear war. And with that, I turn it over to you, Ira. And mute myself.
Thanks, Jeannie. So, we were talking before during the chat session about today's weather, which is sort of an in-the-face reminder to all of us about one of the existential threats we face. And we get these reminders with increasing frequency. The big problem, I think, with the other existential threat that we face, nuclear war, is that it's not in our face by and large. And it's really easy to forget about it. And we have done that collectively, to an extraordinary degree since the end of the Cold War. Back in the 80s, we all got it. And we knew that there was a problem here that we had to deal with. And, literally across the country, millions of people did deal with it. They got politically active around this issue. And that political activism was enormously important in bringing about the end of the Cold War arms race. And I would argue in saving the planet. I think we were clearly headed towards nuclear war in the early 1980s, and the movement that we all participated in stopped that. I don't think we'd be here today if it weren't for the activism that we engaged in at that time. But the problem is that when the Cold War ended, we were all so relieved that we had survived this period that we just put this problem out of mind. And it was not just the usual forgetfulness, there was an active erasure. People did not want to think about how horrible the nuclear danger was, and we didn't. And for 30 years, we've acted as though the problem didn't exist anymore. The war in Ukraine has, I think, changed that to a significant degree. It wasn't the moment when the danger began to grow. This has been going on for at least the last 5 to 10 years. Even before Ukraine, relations between the United States and Russia were at the worst point they've been since the end of the Cold War. Relations between the United States and China are at the worst point they've been at since the early 1980s. The situation with Korea has been intensifying and getting worse. The situation in South Asia, which we don't often pay a lot of attention to, has been bubbling close to the conflict level. India and Pakistan almost went to war twice in 2019. And if they do go to war again, it will almost certainly involve nuclear weapons, to the enormous detriment of the entire world, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. And in addition to these geopolitical areas of conflict, there have been a couple of other factors that have been driving us closer to nuclear war. One is the emergence of the potential threat of cyber terrorism. We used to think that the only thing we had to worry about with regards to terrorists was that one of them might get hold of a single nuclear device and use it to blow up Washington or New York. What a cyber attack. And I'm going to turn off my camera for a minute so that I hope you can hear me okay. Terrorists might carry out a cyber attack against one of the nuclear armed states and cause that country either to launch its nuclear missiles directly or to believe that it is under attack and launch its nuclear weapons as a deliberate action in response to that false alert. And then the final thing that is driving us in a bad direction with regards to nuclear weapons is the first great existential threat, the climate crisis, because it is creating conditions under which nuclear war is more likely. The leaders of the nuclear weapon states always tell us that they want to get rid of their nuclear weapons someday, but the world is too dangerous right now, the time isn't right. At some point in the future, when the world is safer, they'll get rid of their nuclear weapons. The problem is that the world isn't getting safer, it's getting more dangerous, and climate crisis is what's driving this. as this crisis continues to unfold, as it will, even if we do everything that we're supposed to right now, large parts of the planet are finding it more and more difficult to support their populations. And this is causing tremendous stress within societies. The Syrian war is cited by many as the first absolutely classic climate war. It's causing increased migration on an incredible scale, and that's going to get much worse as parts of North Africa, in particular the Middle East, South Asia, become more and more inhospitable to human life. And it's going to cause increased conflict between countries. And if nuclear weapons are around to be used in those conflicts, they're going to be used. So for all of these reasons, the danger has been growing, over the last, decade. But then came the war in Ukraine. And in some ways, this is an unprecedented event since the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we have, for the first time since then, actual fighting, which we didn't have in Cuba, with a nuclear armed state threatening the use of nuclear weapons against other nuclear armed states. The US has threatened to use nuclear weapons against countries like Iraq and Vietnam. But we have not had a situation where one power armed with a large nuclear arsenal is threatening other countries which also have large nuclear arsenals, with all of the danger for all humanity that carries with it. And I think we have to understand that the phrase that was been used by one of our Canadian colleagues is that we are living right now through a global near-death experience. We do not know what's going to happen in Ukraine. We don't know how the situation is going to resolve itself. And as long as it continues, there is the ever-present danger of sudden and rapid escalation to the use of nuclear weapons. So along with that, there's been some increased attention to this problem. And that's the only good news, really, that has emerged from the situation. People are beginning to pay attention again a little bit, not enough, but a little bit, to the fact that nuclear weapons do pose an imminent threat to us. And we need to take advantage of that. We need to really seize what I think is a significant teachable moment, the first we've had in decades, to get people to understand that nuclear weapons cannot be ignored, that they are a real and present danger and an existential threat to our civilization. And we need to have a fundamental change in nuclear policy. There's been this tremendous sense of complacency that somehow or other this system works. We've had nuclear weapons for 70 years. They haven't gone off since Nagasaki, and we're going to be okay. And we need to understand that's not true. As Robert McNamara pointed out, we have not survived this long because we have wise leaders or sound doctrine or infallible technology. We've had none of those things at various points. We have survived this long because, and I'm quoting McNamara now, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. And our luck is not going to last indefinitely. Our current policy is to assume that it will. And that's kind of crazy. Sooner or later, the luck is going to give out. And all the indications are that maybe much sooner than any of us want to think about. I think it's important for us at this moment to engage in significant educational activity to get the general public to understand this. They need to understand three things, really. Number one, that the danger of nuclear war is real and present. Number two, that nuclear war, if it comes, will be much worse than anything we can possibly imagine. And number three, and perhaps most important, this doesn't have to happen. Let me talk for a couple of minutes about what a nuclear war would look like. And I will apologize in advance for getting into this in detail. This is very unpleasant stuff. I think it's worth doing. We all kind of think that we know how bad a nuclear war will be, and none of us do. It's literally beyond our imagination. And so it's worthwhile trying to get as strong a sense of it as we can. Most of us have images in our mind of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these pictures are a very powerful warning about what nuclear weapons can do, but they do not begin to prepare us for what will happen if nuclear weapons are used again. In a war between the United States and Russia, it's not going to be one 15 kiloton, quite small by modern standards, bomb dropped on one or two cities. It's going to be many bombs on many cities, and most of them will be anywhere from 10 to 50 times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I often use a model to try to help people understand what this would look like. a big city like Boston is probably, we don't know for sure, but it's probably targeted by something on the order of 10 to 15 warheads in the Russian arsenal, each of which are probably between 300 and 800 kilotons, so 20 to 50 times bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. The model of a single very large 20 megaton explosion describes almost perfectly the destruction that would be caused by that many smaller bombs. And it's a lot easier to talk about. So let me just describe things using that model. Within a thousandth of a second of the detonation of that bomb, a fireball forms reaching out for 2 miles in every direction. Within this area, temperatures approach the temperature on the surface of the sun, and everything is vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself disappears. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion generates winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that human beings can build. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat is so intense that automobiles melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, which is way out beyond Watertown, the heat is still so intense that everything flammable burns. Paper, cloth, gasoline, heating oil, wood, plastic, it all ignites. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within that entire area, the temperature rises to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen is consumed, and every living thing dies. In the case of Boston, we're talking about 3 to 5 million people dead in a half an hour. In the case of a larger city like New York, perhaps 12 to 15 million people dead in a half an hour. And if this were part of a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, this level of destruction takes place in every major city in both countries. A study that we published in 2002 showed that if just 300 of the 1,500 warheads in the Russian strategic arsenal got through to cities in the United States, 75 to 100 million people would die in that first half hour. Same thing would happen in Russia. And in both countries, the entire infrastructure, everything that the population depends on to survive, would be destroyed. In the aftermath, there would be no internet, no electric grid, no public health system, no food distribution system, no fuel distribution system. All the things that we required to maintain ourselves would be gone. And in the months following this attack, the vast majority of people who did not die during the initial fires and explosions would also die from epidemic disease, from starvation, from exposure, from radiation poisoning. But these are just the direct effects on the countries involved in the struggle. This war between the United States and Russia, would put 150 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun and dropping temperatures across the planet, an average of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's much colder than during the last ice age. And under these conditions, all the ecosystems that have evolved since the end of that ice age would collapse. Food production would stop. The vast majority of the human race would starve to death. And it is possible that we would become extinct as a species. Now, it is important to talk about this, not to create bad nightmares, but to understand that this is not a fantasy. This is not the script of some bad science fiction movie. This is literally the danger we are living with every day that we continue to allow these weapons to exist. And that is why it is so critically important that we get rid of them. And that is the good news, because this is not the future that must be, even though it is the future that will be if we don't stop acting the way we are acting right now. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. It's not as though an asteroid is coming at the planet and we have no control over this. These are little machines. They're about the size of the chairs we're all sitting in. We have built these with our own hands and we know how to take them apart. We've already dismantled tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, but there are 13,000 left that we have not been able to summon the political will to dispense with. And that becomes our challenge, building that political will. Now, Susan's going to talk in a few minutes about some of the things going on here in Massachusetts that we can all be part of. I want to talk for just a couple of minutes about two things. One, the international campaign, very briefly. And secondly, I do want to talk for a little bit about the campaign we've launched here in the US. In response to this danger, countries outside of the United States, countries that do not have nuclear weapons, have become increasingly concerned in recent years about the danger which they are facing because of what we are doing. And they came together at the United Nations after a series of meetings, examined these humanitarian impacts, and voted to adopt the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this was an historic development. It was the non-nuclear weapons states of the world telling the countries that have these weapons, you can't do this anymore. You promised when we signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1969, 1970, that you'd get rid of your nuclear weapons. And it's more than 50 years later and you haven't done it. And now we're going to hold you to it. You've got to get rid of your weapons. After that treaty was adopted, here in the United States, we started a campaign called Back from the Brink, modeled on the ICAN campaign internationally, and also modeled on the Freeze campaign, which many of you may have been involved in back in the 80s. It was organized around the simple principle that we would put forward a prescription of what US nuclear policy ought to be, as opposed to what it is. And it was focused on the 5 demands, the first of which is the most important. It's a call for the United States to begin negotiations now with the other 8 nuclear armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to dismantle their remaining warheads. The campaign started out in Western Massachusetts, where the Freeze campaign started. It has now grown to be a national campaign. Over 400 civil society organizations across the country have joined. 60 cities and towns have joined, including just today, most recently, Chicago. 7 state legislative bodies have joined. We've been endorsed by people like former Defense Secretary William Perry, the late Secretary of State George Shultz, and many other leaders. And I think it is the vehicle that we can use to bring about fundamental change in US nuclear policy that we need. Here in Massachusetts, a bunch of cities and towns, including Boston, Worcester, Springfield, Cambridge, Newton, Brookline, have endorsed this campaign. Watertown hasn't yet, and that is something which you all could think about doing. So let me stop at this point and just close with one thought. We all have, as we do with the climate crisis, an enormous responsibility, and it weighs very heavily, I think, on all of our shoulders. It is not easy to know that everything that we cherish can be destroyed, and that we have the responsibility of keeping that from happening. But I think the flip side of that is that we have an incredible opportunity. All of us are engaged in this group in work to make the world a better place. We want to do something good with our life. We've been given the opportunity to save the world. And there's absolutely nothing better that any one of us can ever do with our life to receive this otherwise fairly grim information and figure out, along with Susan in a minute, what it is that we can all do so that we can enjoy the security of a world free of nuclear weapons. Thanks.
Thank you, Ira. And now we'll hear from Susan Mirsky of Newton. Susan is chair of the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group of Massachusetts Peace Action and a founding member of Newton Dialogues on Peace and War. And she will help us figure out what we can do, or give us ideas on what we can do. Susan.
Hi, hello to you from across the river. There are some people, as I look here and I looked at the participants, some people I know, some names that are familiar, and some people I don't know. But it is wonderful to be here and to hear all the good things that you are doing and your activism, because that is so important, that you get that you are engaged in whatever it is, whether it's racial justice, whether it's schools, the environment, it's engagement. And this topic is important. It's one that is hard to sometimes talk about and engage with people on. You can talk about schools, you can talk about even the environment, and people become engaged with the environment. Somehow the thought of a nuclear war is just so terrible that people feel they don't have any agency to do anything. But in fact, we do. And we do in a variety of ways, depending on who you are and who you're talking with. It's important just to tell a story. So I've been very involved with nuclear weapons ever since I was in high school, way back. And my son now, he's 47. I have these two wonderful kids. And at one point in this past year, talking about what I was doing. And as I was telling him about nuclear weapons and nuclear war, and as Ira is wont to say, and is really, really a reality that is so hard for us to deal with, that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I could see in my son's eyes that moment of that he got a little teary, and he withdrew a little bit. And I talked with him about it. I could sense it, and I backed away a bit. And then we talked about it, and he was saying that he's just got so much he is dealing with. He's dealing with two small kids, COVID, a job, just keeping his family safe, and making enough money to live in his house. And this was something that was so big. So I tried to think about how I talk with people and how I engage with people whose lives are complex, who have all kinds of very real issues that are going on with them. And one way that I have found, or that we have found, is we started this campaign, Fund Healthcare, Not Warfare, where we looked at the budget. And the military budget, boy, Tony, and then I don't know how many of you were engaged with Elephant in the Room, right? Do you remember that? Yeah. So that was looking at the military budget. And so what does that do? How much money does that take away? And at this point, we know that we can't have money for COVID relief, because the money is going into the military budget and for some of that nuclear weapons modernization. So I talk about funding, talk about the corporations, the corporations that make these weapons. So right here, we have Raytheon in our headquarters. And so there are actions that we take on Raytheon. So I just wanted to let you know, let's see. There is, I'll just tell you, on the 30th, we are having a demonstration because Raytheon is funding this home run run for a home run. And so we are going to be standing out there on the 30th with signs about Raytheon not making nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are not good for your health. Doesn't matter you're Republican or Democrat, who you are, as Helen Caldicott, I remember, used to say, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if you are a professor or you're a ditch digger. Nuclear weapons, a nuclear war is not good for your health because it just is the end of everything. So, we try to figure out how we can talk with people just in engaging people that we know, our families, our friends, in any kind of dialogue that you can, understanding where they are at, and thus the danger of nuclear weapons. There is right now a bill that we're trying to get through. I had it here, but you know what? I can't find it. A bill through the state house, and that's both on the House side and the Senate side. Right now, it is in the House Ways and Means, and we are pushing for a positive vote. It had already gone through one committee. This is a bill that looks at nuclear weapons and just say it's to set up a commission to say, let's just look at how nuclear weapons in all of its forms, the making of it, the money, whatever it is, set up a commission for people to look at and then come up with some suggestions. So this is now right before us, and right now, all of us here can be making calls to our state legislators, both on the Senate side and the House side. And out there, Ira is putting it up. I know, yes, 1555 on the Senate side and the House. So make those calls. Let's see, is Brownsburger your person? Brownsburger is not moving on this. So please get to Brownsburger and say, just set this commission up because we need to know more. Activism, Newton Dialogues, we became organized right after 9/11, and lots of people meeting and talking, and then a friend and I came across the river, which we often do, and we saw that you guys were holding a wonderful vigil, and it was so good and so well organized that we thought, we've got to do that in Newton. So we are still doing it. We have maybe 3 or 4 people that come, but we keep on doing it. And hopefully more people will join. Now, Tony, I can just go on and on, so please let me know when my time is up. There is so much going on that you in Watertown have. So Todd Gross, we put on this wonderful program, Hiroshima Day, right? It was about Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
And you are doing wonderful things in the Elephant in the Room, and lots of good stuff. I guess do whatever you can to address this issue of nuclear weapons, nuclear war, in any way possible. The Mass Peace Action website has a calendar of all kinds of activities. Go to that and look at the calendar, look at the various groups that are working. We in the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group, we also have subgroups. One is the TPNW, and right now they are working on that bill. Last year, we put on the twin existential threats of nuclear war and climate change. We have a public engagement group. We have a group that is hoping to eliminate nuclear weapons within the decade. And we have another that's looking at missile defense. But we meet and, oh, right now we have a new campaign. We're working with the Raytheon campaign and the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group. And we hope to address Raytheon that the Raytheon group had in the past been looking at the weapons that they make to send to Saudi Arabia, to bomb Yemen. And now this new campaign will be looking at the systems that Raytheon now has to be modernizing nuclear weapons. So I can go on and on, but I think the most important thing is be engaged in any possible way that you can on this issue, because as Ira said, this is for our lives and for the lives of our children and our grandchildren.
Thank you, Susan. And
let me just speak for Jean. I want to say I put in the chat the link to the information about the Nuclear Weapons Commission that she spoke of. And in it is, you can look at who you should contact. It has a few talking points on it. And it would be helpful if you would make those phone calls. Even though Senator Brownsberger, who is our senator, has not moved on this, I think the more people who can reach out to him, the better. So that's in the chat. And if you want, we'll just, Jane, it's okay to move to questions?
yes,
Does anybody have any questions? And I'll just be monitoring those. So people just raise your hand or.
Tony, you posted a Zoom link. It's not clear what that's for.
I just said it's for the Nuclear Weapons Commission. It's the piece of legislation that Susan was referring to, that you can get information about who you should call in order to make this get out of conference committee. It's the establishment of a Nuclear Weapons Commission.
Tony, it might not be the link you wanted to post. It is a Zoom meeting that you posted.
Okay, I will try again. And Jennifer has a question and I'll try again. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Hi, yes, I think this is a question for Ira. However, anybody who wants to chime in. I was thinking about what you were saying about the treaty for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And I'm thinking about Russia and the aggression that is going on in Ukraine with Russia. What is going to get, even if we got people in this country to start dismantling nuclear weapons, what about Russia?
I mean, I think that's a question on everybody's mind at this point, Jennifer, and thanks for bringing it up. It's a bad situation at the moment. You know, we're in the middle of a shooting war in Europe. This wasn't supposed to happen ever again, but here it is. I think that creates some significant obstacles, but it does not necessarily mean that we can't make progress. In the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, well, let me just frame this a little bit differently. As we move out of this situation, and the war in Ukraine is going to come to an end at some point, there are going to be two competing narratives that are going to develop. One will be the idea that, you know, we absolutely cannot work out anything with the Russians, and we need to spend more and more money on weapons to be safer. The other will be sort of a recoiling from how close we've come to nuclear war and a renewed sense that we need to try to figure out something. And in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was that second narrative that predominated, that won out. You know, within a year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev had very quickly negotiated, signed, and ratified the Partial Test Ban Treaty that set up the hotline, and they had really sort of stepped back from the brink they had brought themselves to. Similarly, in the 1980s, you know, in the summer of 1983, the United States deployed Pershing missiles in Germany, specifically so that we could launch a first strike attack against the Soviet Union. It was an extremely dangerous movement, an extremely dangerous moment. And twice that year, we almost went to war, once in September and again in November. And within a year of that, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, sort of issued a joint statement that nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. It was like a complete reversal of the situation. So I think that, while there's no guarantee of success here, we should not assume that the current fighting makes it impossible to make progress. It is possible that people will have the appropriate reaction to how close we have come to nuclear war at this moment. Realize, as leaders on both sides did previously, that no issue that divides us is worth fighting a nuclear war over, and decide they need to try to move forward. We're not calling for the United States to disarm unilaterally. We're calling on the United States to lead a process of negotiation with the other nuclear armed states. And I think, in the 80s, it wasn't the US, it was the Soviet Union that played that leadership role. It was Gorbachev that initiated things. I don't see that leadership coming from Putin. I don't see it coming from Xi either, although either one of them might surprise us. So I think it's up to us here in the United States to get our government to take that leadership role. And again, there's no guarantee this is going to be successful. We don't know that it will succeed, but we do know what's going to happen if we fail. And so we have to try. And there is reason from the historical precedent to think that this is quite possible.
Thank you, Ira. Mr. Polakov, please.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Ira a question. As an interim first step looking toward eventual disarmament, would it be desirable for the U.S. to unilaterally declare that it would not be the first user of nuclear weapons under any circumstances, and ask the other members of the non-proliferation agreement to make like pledges?
Absolutely. And, the Back from the Brink campaign, the principal demand is for the U.S. to initiate these negotiations, but there are 4 interim steps that we urge the U.S. government to take, and that's the first of them, to adopt a no first use policy. We also ask the United States to take its weapons off hair trigger alert, so they can't be hijacked by cyber terrorists or be launched accidentally. We ask the U.S. to end the current situation where the President of the United States has unchecked authority to launch nuclear weapons. Nobody else has to sign off on that order. The President can do it alone. And we ask the United States to end plans to spend $1.7 trillion upgrading its nuclear arsenal and driving an international arms race. These are all unilateral steps the U.S. could take that would lower the danger while negotiations proceed and provide some momentum to the process. And they should all be undertaken. In the current moment, the other thing that we're asking is International Physicians Prevention of Nuclear War organized a statement with 17 other Nobel Peace Laureates, which we published on the Avaz platform internationally and got 1 million signatures supporting in 5 days use nuclear weapons under any circumstances in the current war in Ukraine. So far, there's been a deafening silence in response to this demand. And we are hoping to raise this issue in a very strong way at the upcoming meeting of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in New York, because it's an insanely hypocritical situation for NATO, the US, France, and Britain, Russia, and China to tell the rest of the world, you can't have nuclear weapons, but we won't even promise not to use them. And that's essentially what they're doing right now. And we're hoping that we can make some progress on this demand that they give a pledge that they won't use nuclear weapons in the context of the NPT meeting.
Other questions? Ira, can you talk a little bit about what took place in Vienna at the first meeting of the folks who have signed on to the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons?
Yeah, it was, Tony, thanks for that. It was a very good meeting. There was a 2-day civil society forum that preceded the formal governmental meeting that was just incredibly high energy. There were like 600 participants there, 500 more online. It was overwhelmingly young people. It was run and organized by young people, which is very inspiring to those of us who sometimes despair about getting young people involved on this issue. It was just filled with people from around the world who were committed to doing something about this. The Austrian government then the next day had a a government level meeting on the humanitarian impact of nuclear war, talking about the kinds of issues that I was talking about earlier, and highlighting in particular a new study that will be released be published either this coming week or the week after in the journal Nature Food, which describes what happens if there's a limited nuclear war, something which I didn't really get into when I was talking before. And I won't take a long time, but just the bottom line of this is the new studies have shown that even a very limited nuclear war, as might take place between India and Pakistan, will cause enough climate disruption to trigger a global famine that will kill 2 billion people and totally, destroy modern civilization. And the import of this, I think, is that the leaders of the United States and Russia think that they're in control of the situation. They have no control over what happens between India and Pakistan. And we have to get them to understand that a war there will destroy their countries too. And so it has got to be their highest priority to get rid of all of these weapons around the planet. And the only way they can do it is if they're willing to give up their own arsenals. So that was presented in some detail by one of the authors of the report. And then the actual meeting itself took place. UN meetings tend to be a little bit boring. One country after another reads a very similar formulaic speech. People try to stay awake. But at the end, there was a political statement issued that was really very important and called for the universalization of this treaty, for pressure to be brought on the nuclear weapon states to sign it and join the treaty, and also called on people to continue with interim measures like no first use efforts as we work to universalize the TPNW, to take whatever steps we can to lessen the danger of nuclear war in the current moment. So a very good meeting.
Wonderful. Any other questions? If not, I'm gonna ask another one. I don't see any other hands. Ira, can you talk a little bit about, and I know it's not immediately in relationship to, I do have a question on Ukraine, but I wanted to ask your thoughts about the situation with Iran and the opportunity to strike a deal, which seems to be slipping away, and the potential for Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and the conflict between Iran and Israel, which does have nuclear weapons. Your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think they pretty much mirror yours, Tony. I think this is a really scary situation right now. We had an agreement that was working. Trump trashed it for the stupidest of reasons because it was Obama's agreement. And Biden was not able to resurrect it as he had expected he would be able to. And I don't know, I don't know enough about the situation to know if that was the US's fault or Iran's fault or both of their faults. But right at the moment, things are not looking good at all. And I think the Israelis have made it quite clear that they will, if necessary, in their view, take military action if Iran develops a nuclear weapon. And so I think this is a very, very dangerous situation. And one of the many things that Trump has left us.
If we did look at that situation a little, if Israel did decide that if there was no treaty, if we couldn't come up with a new treaty between Iran and the United States and Europe, and they decided to continue to enrich uranium and begin to build weapons, and there is the potential strike by Israel that could lead to, at least I understand this, but could lead to, if you destroy a uranium plant, you could have negative effects not only in Iran, but in further outside of the country. Am I right in that?
I think you're absolutely right. The Israelis, there is no good military option, which is why the Netanyahu government opposed the agreement with Iran. Many people in the Israeli military and security establishment were strongly in favor of that agreement because they understood there is no real option. And they were equally upset with when Trump pulled out of it and presented them with just really an impossible situation. There are not good options here other than resurrecting this agreement if it's at all possible to do it.
Any other folks who like to chime in with a question?
can I ask you all a question? I should know this, but I don't. Has your group endorsed the Back from the Brink campaign? Are you part of the campaign?
I don't think we are, Ira. I'd be happy to do that, but I don't think we are. We have been working around the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but I don't think we officially joined in. So we will, if you want to just, I will find a way. We will get on your website and make sure that we are.
That's all you got to do is go to the website and sign up. And the other thing I was going to mention, in addition to, maybe seeing if the city of Watertown would also pass a resolution, Jim McGovern, our congressman here in Western Massachusetts, has now introduced a resolution in Congress, HRes 1185, called to, I'm remembering how they frame this, to embrace the goals and provisions of the TPNW, which is basically a Back from the Brink resolution. And we're trying to get co-sponsors for that. So it would be great to speak with your representative in Congress about being a co-sponsor of this resolution. We don't have a Senate counterpart yet, but are in conversation with Senator Warren's office and Senator Merkley's office and Senator Markey's office about getting a Senate version introduced as well.
Our representative is Representative Clark, who is in.
She's pretty good on this.
Yeah, and she's in leadership in the House. Mr. Polikoff again.
A follow-on question, which is really a narrow tactical question for Ira. Asking for the four things you mentioned is asking for a lot. Stop modernizing our weapons, for example, which is stuff we wouldn't take, I'm sure, unless we had comparable agreements from the other side. From that perspective, Ira, would a simple focus on no first use declaration be a wise initial step, limited to that because it's more achievable than all the basket of four things that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a very interesting tactical question. I don't think it is actually. We've been pushing no first use for some time and have not made a lot of progress on it. And I don't think we're going to make progress on any of these things until we get people to understand that we need to get rid of the weapons. And I think it frankly makes more sense, given that we're not making progress on these supposedly easier asks anyway, to really focus on the critical question, which is that until we get rid of these weapons, we are living on borrowed time. Once people understand that, the interim steps follow logically. But if you don't buy that, then you can come up with all kinds of reasons why, well, if we adopt no first use and the Russians don't, that you start playing the game of chess and you get into this back and forth sort of thing. So I think it's important to advocate for these interim steps also, but I think the time is now for us to focus on the real question. Are we going to save the planet or not? Are we going to get rid of these nuclear weapons or not? And to engage in that conversation. And the whole point of Back from the Brink is trying to create.
We lost you there.
To make this, a significant issue in the 20, even as we've had successfully an effort to create a national conversation about climate, we need to have the same kind of conversation about the nuclear danger as well.
Great.
So that would be my take, on the tactics there.
Thank you. Did you want to follow up, Mr. Polikoff?
But I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
That's okay. Go right ahead, sir.
Ira, as a practical matter, we won't get to persuade the U.S. to get rid of its weapons unless all the other nations possessing those weapons also agree to get rid of theirs. Simultaneity is essential to progress. Analogous to the no first use declaration, would it be useful or desirable as a first step in getting rid of the weapon for the U.S. to announce that if we were to reach agreement with all nuclear states on complete disarmament, getting rid of the weapon, we would agree, we, the US, would agree to get rid of ours too. We have never made such a statement. And if we were to make such a statement, would that be a way of triggering an effort to get everybody to agree?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what the United States needs to do. And that, that is the idea behind our call for the US to take the initiative in bringing about these negotiations. The US needs to state unequivocally that we understand that nuclear weapons do not make us safe, that they are the greatest threat to our security, and that we want to get rid of them. And we will do it when we all do it together. And we will now sit down and figure out the details, because there are some details that need to be worked out on verification, enforcement, timetable, and so on. But the US would absolutely move the needle if it made that kind of a declaration.
Thank you. Susan, you have your hand up.
Yes, I did, and it was up for a while ago, and I totally forget why I it was up in the first place. But just, to respond to some of the things that have been thrown out. Yes, I feel that no first use and pushing for a no first use is important. And it is and it is a part of and embedded in, I think, as Ira is saying, an understanding that, again, we need to get rid of all nuclear weapons. But it is a step that some people can see, and some people feel that, well, if we say we're not going to use them first, then in a sense, why have them? So that is also a way of thinking about the elimination of nuclear weapons. Oh, I know, way back, I was thinking about what we think about nuclear weapons, and can we survive? People will say, can we survive just the use of small nuclear weapons, small tactical nuclear weapons? And I think Ira has pointed out, no, in fact, we can't. And then we have, I don't know if you heard the PSA report out of New York City, where they came out with a recommendation, which was basically, go inside and duck and cover. And, like, how many of you here remember the duck and cover? Yeah? Do you remember that? Right. That was a part of our history, and it didn't make any sense then, but we were kids. What did we know? But now we know that it's absolutely ridiculous, but that's what was sent out. And so there's a lot of education that needs to be done, and it's hard, but it's necessary. Oh, I know, Back from the Brink. So Newton, we did Back from the Brink, and I would be happy to share any of our trials and tribulations and successes in getting that done. Also to say that we Ira did a wonderful program. I don't know if any of you saw it, with the Archbishop, was it San Diego?
Santa Fe.
Yeah, Santa Fe, right. And that was, in a way, getting to people of communities of faith. And I know that, I don't know, there was a meeting that we in Newton had, Newton Dialogues, and we couldn't find a place to have it. So we went to a wonderful church in Watertown, and we were able to have that meeting. So, that's another avenue of a way of talking about these issues.
Thank you. Todd? And then Susan, and then Tyler. We'll go with Todd first.
Thanks, Tony. Hello, everybody. I just wanted to make the comment that, the education and dialogue is extremely important. But one of the things that keeps striking me about this when we were talking about Iran is that there has to be, anything we do that builds up trust is extremely important in whatever we're doing, because Trump broke that trust. And if we make an agreement that we have to have some way, talking about verifying, that we will stick to what we do too, what we said.
Okay, great. Susan, did you have, and then Tyler?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think we all need to remember that a nuclear disaster could come about by accident. And that really needs to be in our message to ourselves and everybody out there who thinks these things just need to go away.
Thank you. Yeah, Tyler?
I'm wondering about clarity on messaging, both who is it who needs to be reached, and are there people who are working specifically on the kinds of messages that reach those people? Because although I did learn some things this evening that I didn't know the specifics of, I feel like the scale of the stakes is not something new to me. It's not that I don't understand it, but when I look at the seeming impossibility of much easier laws getting passed, it feels so overwhelmingly impossible. I think that's why I tend to glaze over about this more than that I don't understand the stakes. But in some other area, like in climate change, I'm aware that I think of hope not so much as like something that's easily available as just like it's the only responsible option. Like you can't give up because it's so important. But that's not by itself a message that engages people who are already feeling overwhelmed. And for example, around like say abortion, there are people who say like, don't talk about like get out of my bedroom, like talk about someone you know will need this, like engage people because it is your problem. So I'm just wondering who's working on messaging and who is the target? Is it policymakers? Is it people like us? Who do we need to reach and how?
I think the target is both. I mean, ultimately, it's policymakers. We need to change policy. But I think what we've learned is that on issues like this, you don't change minds of policymakers until you get a lot of pressure from below. Our leaders are not leaders, they're followers. And we've certainly seen that on climate. It's only when people are demanding change that they've begun to undertake the things that need to be done. In terms of the enormity of the problem, it is a big problem. And I think one thing that's important for us to bear in mind is this is a much easier problem to solve than the climate crisis. I mean, that requires rewiring the economy of the entire world and getting, billions of people to change the way they live every day, what they eat, how they go to work, how they heat their homes, and so on. By comparison, this is a very simple decision. 9 countries could sit down, reach an agreement, and we could have all these weapons gone, 3 years later. And so it's not that big a problem in some ways. In fact, I look at this as sort of almost like a training run. If we can get them together to get rid of the nuclear weapons, the process of doing that is going to show the world how to also then deal with the climate crisis. The other question, though, that you alluded to, I think is a really important one, which is how do we get people to listen to us on this issue? Because it's not in their face every day, and it's not on their minds every day. And this has been the great challenge that we've been dealing with for the last 30 years. How do we get people to recognize that this is something they need to pay attention to? It is changing some. Ukraine has helped. The fact that the climate crisis and the pandemic, both disasters that were predicted by the scientific community and ignored by the general public for a long time, happened. That fact has made people somewhat more open to listening when the scientific and medical community tell them, we've got a problem here that you need to pay attention to. I think we're always looking for ways of trying to message this better. We've spent a lot of time trying to get Hollywood to, make a sequel to The Day After so that we can reach a very broad audience that way. We finally have enlisted in our campaign a significant number of young people who are adept at social media, which I'm not, and are therefore able to reach out to that audience which gets its information from social media. And it's sort of, it's a slowly growing process. The way each one of us plays into this, I think, is figuring out how to access our network. and that's what Back from the Brink is all about. It's trying to figure out how to build a community-wide networks that talk about this. So your group can take a position. You all belong to other groups too. Can you go to your other civic groups you belong to faith communities you might belong to, and get them to be part of this campaign, to bring up the conversation there and invite them to have a conversation similar to the one that we're having tonight. That's how the freeze took off in the 80s. And I'm hopeful that we will be able to replicate that success now.
Thank you. Steve, you're muted. Steve, you got to unmute. Steve.
I know.
There
we go. So I think it's very important to point out, you raised it, Ira. It's the $1.7 trillion is going to be needed, that they want to put in to upgrade all these nuclear weapons. And that's a pocketbook issue that, this is costing the country a huge amount of money. And that money can be put for education. It can be put for all kind, vast number of saving Social Security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people just don't realize what an enormous impact it is on their pocketbook. The silliness of spending trillions of dollars on nuclear weapons.
The pocketbook issue can be very useful in some constituencies in particular. I think we do need to understand that it is probably not going to be the defining issue, the defining way that people make their decision. $1.7 trillion is an obscene amount of money. It's about $30 billion a year in a federal budget that's $1.5 trillion, and in a domestic economy that's about $15 trillion a year. And so, we don't need that money to deal with all the social problems we have. We should use it for that, but we don't need it. And we could divert a lot of that money to social problems and still hold on to a significant nuclear arsenal. So I think this is part of the argument that we make, but ultimately people have to get the core message, which is that nuclear weapons threaten our survival and we've got to get rid of them. But I think it's totally appropriate to focus also on the cost when you're talking to people in local government who are balancing budgets and trying to figure out how to pay the salaries of their teachers and public health officials and so on. This is often a very compelling argument. We should use it as part of the case that we make.
Yes, I was just going to say that that in Newton, that was some of the argument that we made to our city council. And again, it depends on who you're speaking to. And again, they just came out with that, well, not just, a little while ago, came out with a statement that in passing the bill for all of that money for Ukraine and the military budget, they could not cover COVID, money for COVID response. So that was a very, very definite juxtaposition when that came out. It depends, again, it depends on who you're talking to. When you're talking to nurses, when you're talking to people in the healthcare profession, that is very pertinent. When you're talking to city government, you talk about the Red Cross. There is no way that anybody can, that any medical establishment can deal with any kind of nuclear attack. It just depends on who you're talking to, I think. But definitely, again, getting to your groups and your associations and just talking about this issue. And hopefully this group will be able to come up with some kind of a statement and effort about nuclear weapons.
Let me just take a moment to reflect on the challenges I think Ira put out fairly clearly that we have. That is, how do you make it important to people? How do you make it for something that strikes that would make them move? How do you do that? What do you say? And I just want to reflect a little bit on the history, history of the climate movement. You know, the climate movement, which we have pretty strong now, even though it does vary depending on what poll you look at, whether citizens do think it's important. But clearly there are institutions and organizations that have come about because of the climate crisis. And I think of two that pop out to me, and I think a little bit about some of the work in the 80s around nuclear weapons. One is a group called Mothers Out Front. And this is an organization that came to be because mothers, those who were worried about their children and their future. And you also you'll see this true, that a lot of the people who are doing work around climate are people who are older, as well as there's a lot of young people, but there are a lot of older people who haven't been never did political work before, never got involved, and who are now involved because of the threat to them, to their children and to their grandchildren. Now, how we can mobilize folks with the same understanding that this threat to the future of them, their children and their grandchildren is the nut that we have to crack. But let's try to remember that the climate issue didn't just happen. Right? It took a lot of work over a long period of time, people talking about it, and eventually, and of course you have these in your face, as Ira said earlier, realities, the fires in Europe, the huge amount of disruption with these high temperatures that are taking place. So I think while we don't want, right? We don't want a nuclear example. We don't want an exchange, an example of how, right? So you need to figure out how you can say that if there was an exchange, and I think this is where having a little bit of having a handle on the factual information about what could come if there was an exchange, as Ira was talking about, giving his model of what would happen in Boston. I think it's just a matter of continuing to work on the issue, continuing to, as Susan said, using the kind of arguments depending on who you're talking to. But the bottom line that Ira is focusing on is that all the other possibilities, no first use, signing treaties not to further expand on the weapons, all come down to the need to eliminate them. And I think that's where we need to keep the focus on, is how do we convince people that the potential of a nuclear exchange will have devastating effects on our lives and on the future of the planet. And that we need to eliminate the factors that can lead to the destruction of the planet. And those factors are nuclear weapons. And I do think that we should be making alliances with the climate folks. I think Ira's point earlier about the fact that a nuclear exchange, even a limited nuclear exchange, will have a devastating effect on climate. And I think more and more people who work on climate recognize that. So we need to find ways to build on those alliances. But just keep in mind, it's a long path. It's not that people haven't been working on this path. Ira is a perfect example of it. Doing work on it for years, continually to try to educate us and others. And we're going to have our moment. And the Ukraine war gave us a little bit of a moment, but we're in that dilemma where we don't want our moment to be an exchange of nuclear weapons. We want our moment to be a realization by people that we have to do something. So let's just think that, it takes time. We keep pushing. Diana, who is a good example of it, who's sitting here, as a member of our new working group on peace and common security, had long conversations with people like Will Brownsberger, who is against the commission. That's the kind of work that has to be done. So, and I did put the correct link in the email, in the chat. It is a link. It looks like it's going to a meeting, but it actually links you to information about the commission and who you can call. And please, it shouldn't take very long to make those phone calls. And let's see if we can get this Nuclear Weapons Commission, which doesn't cost us any money on the state level, but allows us to discuss the issue, and which is so important to begin to discuss the issue again and again. So please link into that. Click on the link I put in the chat and make the phone call. And Jean, you had your hand up?
Yes, the next thing to do is our Hiroshima Nagasaki commemoration, which is in a few weeks, August 6th. And in that, we remind people that we have seen the effects of nuclear weapons, and we don't want to see them again. So every year, Watertown Citizens has a commemoration of the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. It will be at 7:30 in the Delta and then on the dock in Watertown Square, and people will speak. And it's a way to reach out to the community as well as to commemorate. So I just wanted to put in
No, that's great.
an announcement.
Yes,
A
and
word
please,
from the sponsor.
yeah, please, hope everybody can attend. We'll also be doing the traditional floating of the candle boats from the dock. So it is on Saturday, August 6th, just happened to be the day when the bomb on Hiroshima was dropped. So please join us for that. I wanted to take a quick moment to plug the new working group of Watertown Citizens. That's the new working group is called Peace and Common Security. We're going to be meeting every Sunday on the the third Sunday of every month at 7 o'clock. But it just happens our next meeting is going to be on August 21st at 7 o'clock. And we've been very, as a small group, we're beginning as a working group, but we think it's important that Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment has a working group. And so we invite you to join us. You can join by sending an email to peace@watertowncitizens.org, peace@watertowncitizens.org. And we'll be doing a program in November also at a monthly meeting, but that will be on the topic of Israel and Palestine. And as all these issues are somewhat related, especially when you talk about countries that have nuclear weapons. But let's keep continuing our work. I really hope that you will hit that link in the chat and make a few phone calls tomorrow. I turn it over to you, Jean.
Unmute. Thank you all for joining us. And
Thank you, Ira. Thank you, Susan.
right, thank Ira, thank Susan, and thank everyone else. And we'll see you. There's a message from Mary. The link did not work for me.
All right.
I don't know which link it was that didn't work. Tony, please repost the link.
Okay, will do.
Okay, Tony, I just sent you some information that might have more stuff in it.
Okay.
Up by email.
Okay.
And in fact, people are gathering tomorrow at 9 a.m. at Boston City, at the
Tomorrow?
state. Yeah, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. at the State House. And we're just going to be there. It's not necessarily the lobby day that we did earlier in the week, but we're going to be gathering there, see what happens. So Tony, if you can send out.
Susan, what's the topic of the, which group is meeting tomorrow at 9
And
a.m.?
this is the group that is working on the commission, the Nuclear Weapons Commission. Bill,
Thank you.
and you know, I can send you, or Tony can send you that information.
Well, I'm going to put it in the chat right now.
Okay.
Can you send it out to the Watertown citizens email list? Or maybe that's too much.
You're way ahead of me technologically.
No, I was asking Tony if he could send it to the email list.
Let me put this in the chat first. Okay, there it goes. Okay, try that one, for which will talk about the gathering tomorrow at 9 o'clock, but also give you the information and the talking points that you can use to make your phone calls to the members of the conference committee, which is dealing with the Nuclear Weapons Commission that we'd like to establish in Watertown. It's the kind, I mean, in Massachusetts, it's the kind of activity with it that will keep the issue alive. And so it's the kind of thing that if you could reach out to those folks on the conference committee. And again, we do have Senator Brownsberger, who is not the strongest, will not be supporting it, but there are other members of the conference committee that we should be pressuring. So I just want to take a moment to thank Jean for pulling this program together. This was an idea we had at the working group and the new working group, and she took the reins and contacted Ira and Susan, and we really appreciate it. And I want to just take one more moment. I've been doing this work for a long time, off and on, but not as long as Ira. And his ability to continue to speak so fluently and clearly and passionately about the threat and the consequences of nuclear weapons is really wonderful. So a very, very special thank you to Ira.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Jennifer, did you have your hand up?
Oh, thanks, Tony, and thanks everyone for talking about this.
No, I was just clapping for Ira.
Thank you all. Yeah, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Where's the